I'm going to start with an explanation for the rise and success of the Nazis in Germany. And I'm afraid I'm largely going to be reading this. Then I will discuss how, despite the fact this has been ignored by many historians, a significant minority of the German working class resisted the Nazis. And then I will move on to considering similarities and differences with today, which, as we know, and has already been referred to, is unfortunately becoming quite topical. I'm going to be focusing on the US and the UK. It's usually forgotten or ignored that the Nazis' first aim was to crush the organized working class and destroy the left. Is everything okay?
Yeah.
Can I ask you to mute if you're not
Sorry?
Yes.
Do you want me to go on?
Please.
Yeah. So Nazism's roots lay in the defeat by the ultra-right of the working class revolutions in Germany of 1918-19. So in Munich, already mentioned, a first attempted revolution in November 1918 at the very end of the war failed. But then a few months later, in April 1919, the administration of Munich was taken over by factory councils. Armed workers patrolled the streets during a general strike. A Soviet was declared, but all was very far from well. Ebert, who had become the Social Democratic president, after this I'll be referring to the SPD, after the Kaiser had abdicated, was terrified of revolution. And he sent in 30,000 Freikorps to Munich on May the 1st, at all dates. The Freikorps were a quasi-fascistic, unofficial army of paramilitaries made up largely of ex-soldiers. And they repressed the uprising brutally, executed an estimated 300 men and women, including the Soviet leader Eugene Leviné. The revolution was put down in blood. Many of the the reason why this is relevant is many of the Nazi party's future leaders were members of the Freikorps in Munich. Ernst Röhm, future head of the SA, Himmler, future head of the SS, Heydrich, second to Hitler, Hess, future commander of Auschwitz, and Frank, the Nazi governor general of Poland. And the SA, the stormtroopers or brown shirts, who were founded in 1921 by Hitler, also drew most of its initial membership from the Freikorps. Their first task was to provide the Nazi party basically with protection, but they quickly became a mass organization. And it is generally overlooked that during the later Weimar years, something like civil war took place in some of the streets of Berlin and other cities when the SA street fighting gangs ran a campaign of terror against the labor movement and the left. As I know from interviews I carried out many years ago of people who had been anti-Nazi activists, up till 1933, the SA regularly attacked anti-Nazis on the streets, in the housing estates, broke down people's doors and maneuvered and fought to gain control of meeting places such as taverns, crucial, many fights over taverns, and community centers, and sometimes murdered militants with the police often turning a blind eye. I don't have time for this, but my father, who was a member of the German Communist Party, the KPD, led a Red Front group and used to go off into the woods for target practice, which apparently he was lousy at. But anyway, by 1933, the SA had a membership of around 2 million and support of about double that. And I would argue that the mass movement of the SA was a precondition for the Nazi success. I mean, I think it's quite crucial to understand that. Anyway, on January the 30th, 1933, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, the fight against the labor movement became officially sanctioned state policy. And then the Reichstag fire of February 33 provided an excuse and the Nazis arrested 60 to 70,000 members of the KPD, almost half of its membership, and other left-wingers, of whom some thousands were murdered. And in 1933 alone, about 200,000 political prisoners were detained. And the first camps were not for Jews, but for political prisoners. One reason the Nazis were able to gain power, despite the strength of the German labor movement and the combined vote for the left, was that both the Social Democrats, the SPD, and the KPD, the communists, fatally misunderstood the role of the Nazis and failed to form any sort of united front. The SPD leadership was wedded to the parliamentary road. Their identification with the Weimar Republic led them to conclude there was no difference between the Nazis and communists, as both groups opposed, they argued, the Republic. The leadership were against a united front and didn't in general support anti-Nazi activities. The communist leadership pursued a catastrophic ultra-left policy, refusing to cooperate with the SPD against the Nazis, whom they denounced as social fascists. From about 1928 until about 35-ish, the KPD saw the SPD as their main enemies who acted to embed bourgeois rule. They did not recognize the Nazis' intention was to smash the organized working class, and also didn't call for or support a united front. Making matters even worse, in 33, they thought the Nazis were a temporary blip. And the famous quote is, "After them, us." Ha ha. There were a small number of extraordinarily brave grouplets, such as the Young Socialist Workers, the International Socialist Combat League, the Socialist Workers' Party, who called for a united front and had fallen out with their parent body, the SPD. And there was a breakaway from the KPD opposition, which also demanded a united front. The talk of an anti-Nazi united front from the tiny Trotskyists and other non-communist, non-social democratic left groups all ran into an ideological brick wall, except in a few exceptional areas, such as in Wuppertal, where in fact the Nazis were very strong. But there, an anarcho-syndicalist group called the Free Workers' Union of Germany argued for and tried to construct united action. I mean, they were all arrested and destroyed very quickly. I want to move on to discuss the resistance to the Nazis after they did gain power. I'm only referring here to deliberate resistance, and for further discussion of this, do read our book, which I believe is on sale, kindly organized. And I'm focusing on the resistance of members of the working class rather than on the more publicized resistance, or for example, the brave middle-class White Rose student grouping, or the July 1944 plotters who were led by von Stauffenberg, who was an ardent right-winger. The July plot was led, in fact, by many of the leaders were military, and they were organizing late in the day, primarily because they saw Hitler as leading Germany to defeat, rather than because they had always been anti-Nazis. Broadly, the resistance falls into two phases. It's from 1933 until roughly 35, and then during the war. It's a simplification, but it'll do.
You're muted, Merilyn. She's muted.
Okay, can you hear me? What did you last hear?
Maybe go back to last two sentences.
The last two sentences. I mean, basically, I said that the attempted coup against Hitler in July 44 was led by men who were more concerned with Germany not being defeated than with being anti-Nazis. Then I said that the resistance falls into generally two phases. And the first phase is from 33 to about 35. And one early group who are virtually unheard of are the Gebauer group. I'm very fond of them, who smuggled at great risk thousands of wanted comrades out of Germany, across the mountains into Czechoslovakia, and brought illegal literature in. I mean, it's interesting because it's a group who were peopled by members of the gymnastics and sports movement, the proletarian mountaineering organization, who were crucial because they knew how to get across the mountains, in the Red Front. So, I mean, it's an illustration of how the socialist left in Germany was rooted in cultural activities. Anyway, the second phase of the resistance essentially began after the end of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, a non-aggression pact between the USSR and Germany, which lasted from August 39 to mid-1940. And the focus of the members of the KPD, and of course we're now in war, then became building cells in factories, especially in the arms industry, which is often deadly. One group led by Robert Ulrich, who was a KPD member in Berlin, set up about 20 factory groups. Their priority was to leaflet and organize sabotage and go-slows in factories, contributing to Germany's war effort. I mean, these people were almost all murdered very, very quickly. The network was in touch with about 80 workers in the Berlin Weapons and Armaments Works, Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabrik Berkewerke near Berlin, which employed about 50,000 forced civilian laborers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. A later group led by Anton Zeflov, along with Franz Jakob and Bernhard Bestlein, all members of the Communist Party, probably the largest of the resistance groups, who had about 500 people around them, also focused on armaments factories and similarly called for sabotage and the end of war, which is quite remarkable because they were calling for their own country, basically, to cease fighting. At the Escania works, which specialized in making precision instruments for the armaments industry, and which, quote, employed about 5,000 to 7,000 forced laborers, including later on women from Ravensbrück concentration camp, they built a cell of around 50 people. It's quite interesting, as the war progresses, these groups become more and more open to anybody who wants to join them. While I have no time to develop on my next point, it's worth remembering how far the German war economy depended on the millions of forced and nominally free laborers, prisoners of war, concentration camp prisoners, who constituted 25 to 40% of all workers in Germany and, quote, Greater Germany by around 1944. Even in the crucial armaments industry, which the Nazis didn't wanted staffed by Aryans, between a third and 50% of the workers were foreigners. One example, at Daimler-Benz, a key arms manufacturer with close ties to the Nazi regime, 53% of the workers were Russians as early as July 1942, rising to 67% in 1944. I mean, that opens many questions, which perhaps we can talk about later. The best known of the working class underground groupings was the Baum Group, who, whether for good or ill, is associated with one act of sabotage in Germany when they tried and failed to blow up the Nazi anti-Soviet propaganda exhibition, the Soviet Paradise, in 1942, leading to terrible revenge killings by the SS. However, the Baum Group also organized sabotage at Siemens, another armaments factory, where Baum and others from his group had become part of the contingent of about 30,000 Jewish forced laborers. I must emphasize how important young people were in resisting the Nazis, something we forget at our peril. The Edelweiss Pirates, I'm fond of them, a loose, non-hierarchical network of largely working-class young people. Many actually were women, anyway, have received little positive attention. They drew many of their supporters from the array of youth nature groups, which were a long-term feature of German society. In Cologne, according to Gestapo records, not always reliable, they had at least 3,000 supporters. They wore unconventional clothes, sang anti-militaristic songs, assaulted Hitler youth patrols, at least once with brass knuckles, insulted uniformed officers, robbed Hitler youth, obtained illicit firearms, and produced anti-Nazi propaganda. In one example, they threw bricks through the windows of a munitions factory. In another, poured sugar water into the petrol tanks of Nazi cars. Partly because it was loosely organized, they initially evaded arrest, though they suffered appalling losses in the last years of the war. There were other sources of resistance I don't have time to go into. For example, there was limited resistance in the German army, the Wehrmacht. Hundreds of members who either deliberately crossed only hundreds, deliberately crossed over to the Red Army or loitered on the battlefields in the USSR long enough to be picked up. I also have to mention in passing the amazing 999s, an army unit that political undesirables were herded into and who deserted en masse, especially when sent to Greece. And also hundreds of German refugees volunteered to fight in the earlier Spanish Civil War or later with the British Army. A question which again maybe we can explore in discussion is, why is this history so little known? It is unusual to find much German research on the resistance till the late 1980s, and I want to suggest a few reasons. First of all, the Cold War, which started a few years after 1945, turned communists and fellow travelers into enemies. Regrettably, many historians went along with the Cold War ideology and paid little systematic attention to working class resistance. Secondly, in Germany itself, members of the resistance were regularly viewed as traitors. Even future Chancellor Willy Brandt was called a traitor in the mid-1950s. In the first decades after the war, while members of the Nazi Party received reparations, some members of the resistance found getting reparations very difficult. As late as the 1980s, the son of von Stauffenberg, the same von Stauffenberg who'd led the attempted coup, announced he would not cooperate with the newly established Resistance Museum in Berlin if they included material about communists. That's as late as the 1980s. Finally, and I'm aware this is controversial, the Eichmann trial in 1961 marked the beginnings of a profound shift in the approach to Nazism, which was subsequently increasingly understood as primarily targeting and murdering Jews. I now want to move on to the third part of this talk, which is to consider how we potentially could be facing our own 1933 moment. One crucial difference, and I think a lot of this, some of you in America will know better than me. One crucial difference between what happened in Germany and what is presently happening, at least in Britain, is that the success of the Nazi regime was rooted in the success of the SA street fighters. I would argue, as I said before, it's a critical component of the Nazi success. Here in Britain, grassroots ultra-right street fighting groups have so far not succeeded in mobilizing in significant numbers. And as a few people in the audience I've noticed will remember, in the 1970s, Rock Against Racism helped sway young popular opinion against the racists who were gaining increasing support. But that was 50 odd years ago. And that generation are now at least middle-aged. Another explanation for the absence of fascistic street gangs is that today the British Tory party has absorbed and to an extent defanged the ultra-right. Farage and UKIP did not orientate onto the streets, but encourage their supporters to become members of the Tory party, and indeed have recently successfully become if not the dominant faction in the Tory party. In America, remember, this is me basing myself on the press, there's been a growing presence on the streets of ultra-right gangs. According to the US Capitol Police, cases relating to statements and threats just against members of Congress jumped from almost 4,000 in 2017 to close to 10,000 in 2021, more than double, and I gather have increased even further in the last year. As I write this, on the 29th of October, and a lot of you will recognize our date, an attacker broke down the door of the Pelosi household and attacked Pelosi's husband in lieu of Pelosi herself. Then there was the attempted insurrection on the Capitol in January 2021. And I mean, these attacks have gone beyond just attacks on Congress and the legislature. During a protest against a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville in 1917, Heather Heyer, civil rights activist, was killed. And as the Nazis did before 1933, Trump, I don't know how significant you all think he is, but Trump appears to walk a wafer-thin line between encouraging insurrection and seeking political legitimacy. The relative weakness of the socialist left in the US is in part a consequence, but also in part a cause of the growth in America of ultra-right street movements. The strong American anti-racist movements of recent years have fed into the ultra-right's hatred of a mobilization against social movements. But social movements such as Black Lives Matter or for abortion rights, by emphasizing identity, not class or structural politics, may also contribute to the weakness of the left, especially amongst young people. I'm not in any way trying to suggest I am against either of those movements, in case you might misunderstand me. Indeed, an apparent dissimilarity from pre-Nazi Germany, which we may well not welcome, is the weakness of the left in both the US and Britain, which contrasts with the strength of the left and of the organized, though divided, working class in the 1920s in Germany. It may be that today's relatively weak working class movement does not threaten the profits and power of the capitalist class as it did in pre-Nazi Germany, which therefore is less likely to turn towards fascistic rule to maintain its control and profits. I'm just suggesting that as a hypothesis. Let us not forget that the Nazis in part gained power, not because of the popular vote, but because various sections of the German military and of the political elite thought they could make use of the Nazis to create coalitions in the Reichstag to keep the communists and the Social Democrats out of power. In the early 1930s, big business, for example, the steel magnate Fritz Thyssen, started to pour millions of marks into the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party only won 2.6% of the vote in 1928 election, but by November 32, their vote was around 37%. Still, however, not a majority. The combined vote of the KPD and the SPD was about 36%. But the main right-wing parties, the Centre Party and the Nationalist Party, had only gained 20% of the vote. They wanted to keep out the left and attempted to hold on to power through using President Hindenburg's controversial powers to rule outside Parliament. While this can only be conjecture, there remains a question as to how far, and I'm not sure about this, how far the Nazi dictatorship was an inevitability, or could the right-wing parties have constructed some form of extra parliamentary authoritarian government without ceding power to Hitler. Anyway, while the first past the post system of elections in Britain has helped prevent a fascist party gaining parliamentary seats, I know that's not a popular position here, but still, we only need to look at Europe for coalitions including or even led by the extreme right in Italy, Sweden, Hungary, and Poland. Indeed, in Hungary, uniform paramilitary forces connected to the fascistic Our Homeland movement have returned to the streets, pursuing the twin-track strategy of street fighting and support for Orban. And while the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, has been losing ground in the national elections, it came first this year in the local elections with around 25% of the vote in Saxony and Thuringia, in what was East Germany. In France, Le Pen may have lost in this year's presidential elections, but she gained about 32% of the vote in the second round. The new far right is becoming normalized across Europe. What the ultra-right parties and the right of the Tory party have in common is a stress on nationalism, and increasingly of the refugee or migrant as an outsider or invader, to be kept out by a number of deadly means, and if admitted, regularly facing racist laws and discrimination. Brexit, though not openly rooted in racism, has fueled a sense that the British have a national identity rooted in the glories of empire, and therefore, though rarely stated, that the white Britisher is a superior being. The present British government has the barbaric policy of transporting refugees to Rwanda and of, in effect, incarcerating asylum seekers who arrive here by boat in concentration camps. Yet I would argue that the manifestation of nationalism in the US, of America first, and the mobilization of the ultra-right rooted in a bedrock of slavery and segregation is far more steeped in racism than the early Nazi movement. Anti-Semitism was always a theme in Nazi propaganda, the glue which helped hold the early Nazi party together. But people forget or ignore how gradually anti-Semitic measures took hold. There were heinous restrictions on Jewish people from 1933, and after Kristallnacht, or the Night of Burning Glass, in November 1938, the first mass arrest of Jews and the physical destruction of Jewish institutions. But it was only in the autumn of 1941 that Hitler decided to start deporting Jews from Germany and Greater Germany, and only after the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, that the German state institutionalized mass extermination, as we know, with terrible, terrible millions dead. But one often ignored difference is that a crucial appeal of the National Socialists, that's because that's what Nazi Party stands for, was their adoption of a quote, socialist platform, quote. The faction around the SA in particular railed against inequality, the rich and the privileged, not initially equated with Jews, demanding high taxation, job creation programs, and so on. One reason why Hitler had Röhm, the head of the SA, murdered in 1934 was that the rhetoric of the SA was seen as alienating big business. At least in the US and in the UK, no right-wing party has developed a similar quote, socialist program. Maybe we could discuss how far Trump tries to combine pro-business policies with his appeal to working class whites. Another similarity between Germany in the 1920s and now is the level of disillusionment with the political system. In Britain, and I suggest in the US, as in pre-Nazi Germany, there is a growing lack of credibility in the major mainstream parties. In the UK, previous working class voters who came from a Labour voting background, sorry, I should have said many previous working class voters no longer identify with the Labour Party, one reason behind the switch to the Tories in the so-called Northern Red Wall seats. Moreover, the open marginalization of supporters of Jeremy Corbyn here and maybe of Bernie Sanders in the US has contributed to a disintegration of the traditions of party loyalty and led to political disillusionment, especially of the young. In addition, the sharp drop in working class trade union membership in Britain also suggests a decline in support for collective solutions, again, especially in younger generations. The increasing lack of rootedness in traditional collective organization opens the door to ultra-right allegiances. But despite the myth, it was not the German working class who supported the Nazis. The German working class probably had the highest level of unionization ever, and the KPD was the strongest communist party anywhere in the world. But the largest occupational group who voted for the Nazi party were teachers, who saw themselves as threatened by rising inflation and by a militant working class. Another group who supported the Nazis were the unemployed, who found the Nazis' promise of strong rule and jobs appealing. And while I don't want to draw too close a parallel, the growing number today of people loosely categorized as the precariat, the insecurity associated with employers' increasing use of fire and hire and of outsourcing, and the increase of home working, partly because of COVID, all mitigates against unionization and further limits workers' experience of solidarity. Further opening, I'd suggest, the ideological door to nationalistic and racist ideas. In Britain, as in Germany, in the 1920s, we are facing soaring inflation and a severe cost of living crisis, which will impoverish millions, and it could also lead to the growing popularity of the ultra-right. These days, climate change is also pushing governments towards authoritarianism. The increasing numbers of refugees trying to find somewhere where they can survive, and the almost inevitable increase in food scarcity due to changes in world weather patterns will encourage governments to introduce increasingly repressive and authoritarian solutions. Moreover, although the environmental movements and NGOs play a significant part, neither are likely to fundamentally challenge the system or to argue for the necessary collective solutions. So to conclude, today's circumstances are not auspicious, but history does not repeat itself. What happens next is unclear. Is the situation in America of multiple armed street gangs and a right-wing populist movement a prelude to a new ultra-right authoritarianism? Or will the present absence of a centralizing organization, such as occurred in Germany, the Nazi Party, and a ruling class which in general does not support extreme right politics, prevent this? Maybe what we're witnessing in Britain, maybe, is a highly autocratic, xenophobic government, which, because it has succeeded in keeping a lid on working class and other discontent, may provide at least temporary alternative rather than a prelude to a new Nazism. But as you can hear, I'm not sure. So we all need to organize in our trade unions, our community groups, in popular movements, including the environmental movements, against all forms of racism, xenophobia, and state repression, and for a system of climate justice. Thank you all very much.